Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Sociology of Terrorism. Today we're going to chat about the development and the evolution of the field of the sociology of terrorism. What distinguishes this from, say, the psychology of terrorism? So sit back, grab a snack, and let's talk about sociology. Since September 11th, there's been a ton of interest in understanding the causes of terrorism, why terrorists do what they do, how terrorist organizations are created and maintained, the conditions that make terrorism more or less likely, and the ways we attempt to counter or prevent terrorism at the national and international levels. Often viewed as an event that sort of triggered the development of terrorism studies as an overarching field, you can trace studies of terrorism back to way before September 11th. Scholars have long been interested in documenting, tracing, and understanding the roots of political violence and its historical, cultural, religious, and social consequences. The truth is, the events of 9/11 didn't create the field of terrorism studies. It simply expedited its evolution and amplified its voice. Better understood as an event that shifted and stimulated growth within the field, rather than an ethos sort of changing moment, 9/11 in many ways led to an expansion of the broad field of terrorism studies, with the development of the sociology of terrorism being one part in that growth. Other disciplines within the paradigm of terrorism studies are political science, psychology of terrorism, international relations, economics, history, cultural studies, and many others, all that look to answer very different questions than the ones posed by sociologists. So what is the sociology of terrorism? The sociology of terrorism is a field that attempts to understand terrorism and terrorist activities as social phenomena, meaning that related activities are conditioned by both individual and structural actions. In other words, sociologists focus on how things related to terrorism are conditioned by all actors involved, both individual and structural, that make up the society in which we live. How is terrorism itself a social construction, and thus not a given or a natural occurrence in any society? What social conditions make terrorism more or less likely? How do individuals and states respond to terrorist activities? How do government authorities attempt to prevent terrorist attacks before they manifest? Rather than focusing on terrorism as the result of solely individual pathology or geopolitical conflict, sociologists argue that the very idea of terrorism is a social construction, and we must therefore interpret events and their presumed causes as both a product of and cause of change in the social world. Rather than focusing on how terrorism manifests as a result of individual psychopathy, sociologists would focus on the environments that drive folks to engage in terrorist activities and the strategies they use to manipulate perceptions as a result of their violent behavior. This is certainly not to suggest that other fields do not take great care in pondering these questions. It's just that sociologists are guided by the fundamental principle that terrorism and related phenomena are social constructions rather than the result of psychopathy, geopolitics, or religious idealism. And to answer these questions, sociologists engage in empirical analysis of a variety of data sources, from quantitative analysis of big data to ethnographic work of terrorist organizations. Sociologists collect data related to terrorism and analyze them through their established methodologies. The way they do it is not dissimilar to what you'll propose in your final research project, so perhaps you should read the first bunch of articles with that in mind. Early work within the field of the sociology of terrorism post 9/11 focused on how different actors define terrorism, how terrorist propaganda proliferates, how media covers terrorism and the much maligned war on terrorism, the relationship between counter-terrorism and immigration policies, the expansion of police powers and intelligence powers, and their implications on privacy issues, and how moral panics after September 11th stigmatized already vulnerable and racialized individuals and groups. Since then, the sociology of terrorism has grown into a diverse field that makes use of traditional and innovative empirical and methodological techniques to address myriad questions related to the role of counterterrorism and terrorism in everyday life. Increasingly, sociologists are questioning the consequences of aggressive, militaristic policing of so-called terror threats that negatively impact human rights and thus stifle social justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. Others have documented the cultural and political overreaction to supposed terrorist threats that has resulted in the further marginalization and criminalization of Muslims, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color through a host of new police powers and punitive measures. For example, scholars have traced the ways in which rhetoric used in the war on terror has been used to criminalize new immigrant communities throughout North America. And even more recently, the field of sociology of terrorism has expanded to include activities and beliefs that have not historically been understood as terrorism, including hate crime, right-wing extremism, and incel-related violence. Theoretically, sociology has long relied on a number of core perspectives, namely structural functionalism, conflict theory, including feminist and intersectional theory, symbolic interactionism, critical theory, and critical terrorism studies. While sociology is much more robust than this picture paints, we'll talk about these throughout the course, and a brief description of what is offered by them is pretty important here. Structural functionalists suggest that society functions as a complex system made up of interconnected parts. Much like your body is a set of parts that work together, the brain, the heart, the lungs, the digestive system, they all work together, and your body enters a state of dysfunction when one of them stops working. Society is made up of a set of parts, or we can call them systems, that ensure the so-called proper functioning of the system. Political institutions, governments, religious communities, educational institutions, and the economy, and so on, all work together to promote social solidarity, order, and system stability for the entire social structure. Keep in mind here, for functionalists, the term function is not a moral one, like a function is good or evil or right or wrong, but an analytical concept. In other words, something that is functional is not about whether it is good for society. It's whether it promotes stability within the system. In that way, both functions and dysfunctions can promote or hinder social stability. Functionalists see terrorism like they see other forms of criminality, temporary deviations from the so-called proper or normal functioning of a society, a dysfunction that threatens or promotes the stability of the system as a whole. Just as functionalists have found that crime serves a function in society, they often view terrorism as functional because it promotes social solidarity in opposition to, say, a government or foreign policy, and in turn brings about a sense of belonging to the group opposing it. For example, a functionalist might say that the tragic events of 9/11 were horrible, but functional, because they were the result of people coming together in opposition of US foreign policy, and then stimulated group cohesion centered on nationalist pride in North America. Let me be very clear. Remember that functionalists do not suggest that function equals good. It is simply an analytic term to describe the purpose that an action serves. I'm also not suggesting that this take is an accurate one, but is simply a byproduct of the theoretical perspective. Another example of sociologists using a functionalist approach towards terrorism has been work that seeks to explain terrorism using Durkheim's infamous typology of suicide. You might recall that Durkheim differentiated groups of suicide: egoist suicide, which corresponds to a low level of social integration; altruistic suicide, when a group dominates the life of an individual to a degree that they feel meaningless to society; anomic suicide, when suicide is caused by a sense of normlessness or anomie that arises from social instability; and fatalistic suicide, where one has too much ritualization and social regulation and thus has nothing to look forward to in life. Sociologist Mahmoud Sadri applies this typology to terrorism, arguing that so-called terrorists follow a similar pattern. Egoistic suicidal homicides are most often the result of suicide pacts or murder-suicides, whereas altruistic suicides might consist of more organized suicide missions based on ideological motives, for example, as we saw in the 9/11 attacks. And finally, anomic suicides are often associated with acts of terrorism and involve mass suicide or mass murder. For example, the Columbine murders, or the case of Alec Minassian and the van attack on Yonge Street in Toronto. Functionalists thus argue that terrorism can be used as a touchstone for society at large. It might represent the functioning and dysfunctioning of society and might actually work to reinforce the norms and rules of particular societies. In other words, in order to protect the so-called normal functioning of society, or the status quo, society uses terrorism as a way to reassert the importance of a typical social norm. Terrorism is thus framed as a threat to society at large, which might cause instability in the lives of individuals. A large-scale terrorist attack, on the other hand, threatens the slow, well-planned evolutionary change of a healthy social system, and thus must adapt. This can stimulate the identification of new norms or ways to protect the functioning of the system, or it can destabilize society. The job of the sociologist, then, is to document, analyze, and understand these changes. Conflict theory is perhaps best described as a group of theories rather than a standalone singular theory. This perspective emphasizes what is called a materialist view of history, that history must be understood as a result of material conditions of society rather than the ideals of such a society. To do that, conflict theorists tend to argue for a dialectical method of analyzing society. That is, in order to understand society, we must first take a critical stance towards the material conditions of that society in order to reform or change it. We must seek to change the existing social arrangements that have resulted in conflict between groups. These folks tend to see the control of conflict between groups as the mechanism through which power manifests, and groups are thus subjugated. In this way, conflict theorists have argued that the mass expansion of anti-terror law in countries like Canada and the United States is a technique to maintain social order that benefits the status quo while wielding sovereign power over already marginalized groups like new immigrants, refugees, foreign nationals, and non-residents. Other conflict theorists approach terrorism as a sort of inevitable reaction to various forms of injustice that drive folks to view violence as a reasonable response to what they see as a legitimate grievance with the social structure that continues to harm them. Seeking to change a system that systematically victimizes them, some of these folks resort to violent conflict to attempt to gain power in their own position. In response to this, those who control conflict attempt to maintain the status quo via laws, policies, and the monopoly of physical force, and can then define the actions as terrorism and use their power to subjugate those individuals and groups to sovereign power. For conflict theorists, analyzing society is about analyzing conflict between groups of people, most often, but not exclusively, along class conflict lines. Feminist theory is an extension of this conflict theory that aims to explicitly understand the nature of gendered inequality as a dominant mechanism of social conflict. Feminists have, rightfully so, critiqued the social structure for being constructed upon such historical ideals and have empirically documented the harms and problems associated with this. These folks have documented the ways in which women have been systematically disempowered and subjugated by men throughout every social institution, and illuminated the ways in which this interacts with other forms of subjugation. In the context of terrorism, scholars have documented the androcentrism that in many ways remains at the heart of terrorism studies. They have highlighted that the field has been dominated by the male gaze, and that feminist perspectives offer a unique perspective on why and how terrorism manifests in society. By focusing almost exclusively on men who commit terrorism, the field has not only contributed to the maintenance of patriarchal tropes about violence, but it's also missed a number of opportunities to offer more nuanced analyses of how terrorism actually exists in the real world. More contemporary conflict theorists have moved away from class as the central unit of analysis in lieu of intersectional analyses of race, gender, sexuality, disability and ability, nationality, and so on, which highlight how a person's social categorizations manifest in different modes of discrimination, oppression, and privilege. Intersectional and critical theory scholars have highlighted how terrorism and discourses about terrorism and about counter-terrorism systematically work to maintain power that continues to subjugate vulnerable and racialized groups. These folks argue that discourses about terrorism and counter-terrorism, media narratives about how to prevent so-called Islamic fundamentalist terrorism, by example, work to maintain a social system that views Muslims as the so-called alien other to settler colonial states like Canada and the US. Increased police violence, intelligence targeting, surveillance, and punishment is therefore justified systematically against a particular group. Distinguishing from the more macro sociological approaches of functionalism and conflict theory, symbolic interactionism focuses on the micro-level social interactions in which shared meanings, assumptions, ideas, and motivations behind individual action are shaped. Interactionists maintain that we can understand the collectively created social world through focusing on face-to-face interaction, meaning-giving, and symbolic understanding. For these folks, group membership and the identities in which that forms is one of the major factors in how individual interpretations of reality are shaped. It is thus incredibly important for interactionists studying terrorism to focus on how lived experiences shape individual interpretations of reality, which push or pull people into or away from terrorist activities. Whether it be a process of labeling, social learning, or differential association, symbolic interactionists focus on the ways in which face-to-face interaction with others and symbols shape individual interpretations, beliefs, and ideas that drive people towards violence, and how groups and groupthink work to create, establish, maintain, or promote such extremist ideas. For example, a symbolic interactionist might focus on how social media propaganda is disseminated by a terrorist organization, and then how it's consumed by young people and used as a way to recruit them into the organization. An organization that can then reinforce and promote those beliefs through surrounding the recruit with similar messaging. On the flip side, scholars like Kurt Braddock have focused on how counter-narratives seek to provide the opposite narrative and how these counter-narratives can be used as an effective counter-terrorism tool. There are a number of sociologists working in the field of critical terrorism studies. This is an interdisciplinary field of political, legal, historical, and sociological scholars who tend to focus on countering the hegemonic and perhaps dogmatic traditional approach to terrorism as a fundamental threat to the world. Critical terrorism studies adopts the epistemological position that the nature of knowledge in terrorism studies as a whole is a social process which relies on contextual factors, including the influence of the researcher. In other words, we must critique the link between power and knowledge, and thus our own position in that relationship. Explicitly approaching terrorism as a social construction, scholars working within critical terrorism studies focus on how discourses and practices of terrorism are defined and understood to apply to a very specific set of violent acts that target hegemonic authorities. For example, critical terrorism studies research focuses on how the label terrorism has long been applied to international religiously inspired political violence, but it is just now being used as a label to describe white supremacist groups who engage in similar activities domestically. There are a number of research areas within the critical terrorism studies paradigm, each which include their own set of ontological or epistemological foundations. We will explore a number of these throughout the course, including critical gender studies, surveillance, privacy, state-sponsored violence, preemption, and technology and terrorism. You can read all about how the field of terrorism studies has played out empirically, theoretically, over the past several decades in the course readings for this topic. And just a brief reminder, the course readings are intended to complement these lectures. It makes very little sense for me just to present you with a PowerPoint that repeats what you're reading, doesn't it? Think of the course readings as more context and insight into what I talk about in these videos. The readings paint a very important picture that sketches out the fields of sociology of terrorism and critical terrorism studies. What I want you to take from it are ideas. What do I mean by ideas? Well, you do have a final research proposal that you need to be thinking about. And these articles not only talk about where the field has come from and how it has evolved, but also they point to areas for future research, areas in which your research proposal could fit. So, for your online discussion responses and participation, I want you to use the video and the corresponding readings and videos posted to OWL to answer the following questions. What areas of sociological research on matters related to terrorism and counterterrorism remain unanswered today? What topic or issue related to terrorism still seems confusing or unanswered to you? If you were to think of an area of research you might pursue in the sociology of terrorism, what would it be? You could even go as far as to already present a preliminary research question, and then perhaps I, as the professor, will comment on that and give you some feedback that you can use in your research statement. You know, everything in this course is really connected, and I'm just here to help you in your intellectual journey. So that's it for today. You are now an expert in the field of introductory sociology of terrorism. This is Prof. Silva signing off, and we'll see you on the next one.